Thanks very much, Peter, and thank you all for sort of coming here after the lunch break. I suppose first of all to say thanks very much to the organisers for inviting me here today, and I suppose especially to kick off this forum on injury prevention. It gives me a chance to share with you, I suppose, some of the work that we've done under the sponsorship, really, of the GAA Medical and Scientific and Player Welfare Committee. After I finish then, we're going to talk to the two girls in the middle of this presentation, and then Enda will talk very specifically, I suppose, about the initiatives that he's been working on with the LGFA. I suppose injury for us all is something that's very present in our minds. We all either have been injured at some point in time, or we know people that have been injured, and as coaches it's something that you're dealing with from day to day. There have been some very high profile injuries captured on film, and these three here are famous ACL injuries. The first we saw there was a contact injury here with Henry Shefflin and Paul Griffin. They're non-contact injuries where nobody collided with the player as such. So I suppose to get that concept, first of all, that some injuries may be preventable and some injuries may not. All of the Gaelic games are competitive sports. They're played with high intensity, high commitment. They all involve activities of high speed and velocity, rapid changes of movement, stopping, starting. And they all involve elements of jumping, landing, and sprinting, and also the robust player contact. And I suppose one key thing with sports like this is that with any sport, that you have a chance of injury once you participate, so that participation actually in training and also in match play exposes an individual to a risk of injury. So it's something inherent in sport. We can learn from other sports because I suppose the body of evidence that we have around our own games may not be as well published and publicised. So looking at, I suppose, the mechanics of sprinters like Usain Bolt and looking at landing and jumping, directional changes, both in team field sports but also sports on the court and individual athletics as well, will give us information. And to prevent injury, really, we have to have a framework. We have to have a plan about how we're going to go about this. And one of the first elements of this really is to establish the size and the extent of the problem. So we need to know how many injuries are occurring, what are the common ones, where do we need to focus our energies. After that then, to look at the causes and the risk factors for injury. And then from there we have a platform that we can develop and test prevention measures. And really at that point then, it's back to grassroots level. And the hardest piece in this jigsaw really is implementation of the evidence for injury prevention in the real world. So down at coaching at juvenile and adult team level, back down to the clubs and to the grassroots people. So starting from this, I suppose the GAA Medical and Scientific and Player Welfare Committee took a very, I suppose, far-sighted approach back in 2006 when they, I suppose, first brought up this notion of starting to monitor and evaluate the number of injuries that were occurring. So there was a pilot project in 2007 and it has actually been running at inter-county level for all of the years since then. The aims of this, I suppose, ultimately are to enhance player welfare and also to establish the foundation for a reduction in injury rates. So this is an online system where we have the county team physios or doctors who submit weekly information to a secure online web portal. It's been happening fairly successfully. We have some stalwarts who report year on year, but we're always looking for more recruits and more commitment from the county level teams. So to give you an idea of the main findings from this, and I suppose first of all to say that I suppose we have information now on, well, between 2007 and 11, almost 2,500 injuries, and that has grown further in 2012. So in that 5-year period, with 29 football teams, 26 hurling teams participated, and each player was registered for an individual season. So we didn't have over 1,000 players, but we had 1,000 player seasons for football, and just short of 900 in hurling. The average age of the players was just over 24 years, and players were ranging in age from 18 to 36 in both codes. The total number of injuries, I've already said, is it's quite a substantial, I suppose, number of injuries there that we can actually make reasonable inferences from. We saw that between 67 and 71% of all players are injured in any given season, and over a third of players get more than one injury, and that we also have a high recurrent injury rate. So the main findings, I suppose, from those basic sets of information is that 2 out of 3 players on a team will get injured in any season. Over a third of players will have multiple injuries, and up to a quarter of injuries will actually be a recurrence of an old injury. I suppose next, where do the injuries happen? Is it in training? Is it in match play? And I suppose intuitively you'd have to imagine that it would actually be in the heat of a competitive game, and that's borne out by our figures. The first things here are percentages, so I suppose in around 60% of injuries actually occur in both sports in the course of a match. But because we spend many more hours training than you do in match play, when you standardise it according to the hours of exposure, you're actually 14 times more likely to get injured in a football game than in football training, and almost 21 times more likely to get injured in a hurling match than in hurling training. So again, this is something that you see in all sports, in all competitive sports, that it's I suppose the performance requirements and the intensity and the competitiveness of the game is where the highest risk is. Then looking at the distribution across where in the body the injuries occur, and I suppose in all field games, we find that lower limb injuries would predominate, and we see it here again both in football and in hurling. So again, just bearing in mind that this is data from male inter-county teams, but we have some preliminary information from some ladies inter-county teams as well. So 76% and 68% of injuries we see here in the lower limb, so basically anything from your hip, pelvis downwards. And in the ladies' data we're seeing about 78%, so it's mirroring this. In the upper limb, between just over 11% in football and a higher percentage than in hurling, which again, I suppose is common sense, but we now have the data to support that. And then in the trunk, which is your back, your ribs, your chest, abdominal strains and pulls and things like that, about 8% across both codes, and in the head and neck, between 3 and 4%. Just looking briefly at the upper limb, what I've circled here are the upper limb injuries in hurling that happen below the elbow, basically, and that's where the predominant numbers of those are. So you're looking really at a higher fracture rate and a higher, I suppose, contact injury below the elbow in hurling, and shoulder injuries are comparable in both sports. For lower limb injury, sort of knees, ankle, pelvis, groin, fairly comparable across both groups, but there's a much higher rate of hamstring injuries in football than in hurling. But it is of note that hamstring is the most common injury overall in both of the games. So this is the one that's going to cause most of the players to actually have problems, to have recurrent problems, these are the type of injuries that are the most common, maybe not the most serious, but once a player has a problem, it's something that will come back to them again. I'm sorry, my presentation's jumping forward here. So upper limb and lower limb done, and now back to, I suppose, head injury and concussion, which again would be injuries that would be of concern, I suppose, in terms of their potential nature and long-term consequences. As we saw, about 3% of total injuries are to the head in football, 2.6% in hurling, and I suppose we have seen, we can already see, I suppose, that there have been some changes in pattern with the introduction of the rule change in helmets since 2010. So there have been no eye injuries, there have been no dental injuries actually since the helmets have been introduced at all grades. And concussion injuries account for about a third of all the head injuries. So you can still, I suppose, have a concussion if you're wearing a helmet, and sometimes, I suppose, we have occasions where maybe there's been a failure where the player might have actually sort of taken out a bar of the helmet to actually give them better visibility. So I suppose, I think these are of concern, but I suppose bearing it in mind that they are about 1% of injuries overall. Something I suppose all coaches and trainers will want to know about is how long is a player going to be out. And I suppose we took some of the common injuries, and I suppose excluding the ACL injuries, which would be the most severe knee injuries, which a player is literally gone for the remainder of that season. On average, knee injuries, you're out for about 15 days for a new injury, so over 2 weeks, and the same again for a recurrent injury. What is kind of note here, that for your first hamstring, you'll be out for more than 2 weeks, but if you have a recurrent hamstring strain, you're going to be out for almost 5 weeks. So some injuries, if you don't rehabilitate them properly at the beginning, if you come back too soon, it may actually have longer term consequences and longer time out as you get a recurrence of that injury. Looking at the pattern then across when do they occur in competitive games and also in sort of structured training sessions and challenge games, about 60% occur in the second half. So there may be an element of fatigue. We heard earlier on about, I suppose, nutrition, dehydration, all of those things in terms of game preparedness may come into play here. But certainly as well, I suppose, which is of note here, is that after the half-time break, there seems to be a higher percentage of injuries. So maybe that is, I suppose, people coming back with more intensity and commitment. Next, how are the injuries happening? And as I mentioned earlier, some injuries are contact injuries and may not be preventable, and some injuries occur as the player is running and jumping by themselves, and it's probably these ones that we have more control over trying to prevent. So about 60% of injuries occur in non-contact, and about 40%, so between 32% there in football and 39% in hurling. So there are, I suppose, a high proportion of injuries that we may be able to modify the risk factors for. And then just to sort of throw this up here as well, just looking at the ACL injuries, we see the same pattern there. About 35% actually occur in player contact, and the remaining 65% in running, jumping, landing, and other sort of on-field activities. And I suppose maybe this might be a good time now to actually talk to our two players here, to Niamh and to Geraldine, who might actually tell us about how their injuries actually occurred. So they both have had ACL injuries, and Niamh looks like she's ready to talk there, so we'll ask her first. Is this on?
Yeah. Well, I actually been fortunate enough to do both my cruciates. I did the first one in 2003, and in both cases it was probably a mixture of turning and contact, so I was tackling somebody and they turned, and with a slight bit of contact from them as well. I tore my ACL on my left knee in 2003, and then I was unfortunate enough to do my right one in 2010. So that's really...
Yeah, and so you both had surgical repair of both of those? And
yes, I had surgery in 2003. I actually had Dr. Ray Moore did it, and I had a patella graft put in. And then in 10, Dr. Niall Hogan did it, and it was a hamstring graft. So it was sort of that I had experienced the two different types of operation. But thankfully, both have been very successful, and I haven't had any trouble with them, either of them, since.
That's great. And Geraldine, did you tell?
Yeah, I did. I just did my left cruciate in 2010. I would have been soloing with the ball at the time, going straight, and then I got contact on my left side. It was probably my standing leg at the time, and then I tore my ACL, and I got mine done in Sanctuary with Dr. Ray Moore as well, and it was a patella tendon insertion.
Okay. I know Angela might come back and talk to you about your rehab again, but I suppose of note there, it's actually your standing leg, so the leg that you're actually weight bearing on and are pivoting on, which seems to have been, I suppose, the classical mechanism for both of you. So I suppose the two key areas that we've kind of see that ACL injuries occur is in landing, when the knee buckles, and also in a single standing position where the foot gets planted and stuck on the ground, and the upper part of the body turns, and the ligament can give. So I know Enda will show you much more about that again, and the type of exercises that we can do. So I suppose moving on then, so having counted the injuries and knowing how they happen, we have to start then thinking about a plan on how we might be actually able to alter them and prevent them. And I suppose bearing in mind here as well that injury is multifactorial, that there are the physical environmental factors, and there is some evidence to show that artificial turf in some sports where they're using it a lot may actually cause a higher injury rate. There's also rules, enforcement, and player behaviour. And then building then on the sort of platform of training, rehabilitation, injury management, and return to play protocols, these are all sort of funneling in down on top of individual player factors. So their age, their prior history, their readiness to play, and I suppose their fatigue. And if you look at a lot of the literature that's out there, actually having a previous injury is the single strongest predictor of having an injury again. And there's also an increase in injury risk as we age. So that's down to tissue aging, and I suppose it's a relationship there as well between having picked up previous injuries in the past. So I suppose that this bit in here, when we're talking about injury management, return to play and training, is what we're going to focus on from here on in. And what I suppose the sort of buzzword in the scientific literature really is talking about neuromuscular control. So the interaction, I suppose, of your nerves firing off your muscles automatically to allow you sort of better control of your movements. And the idea of, I suppose, improving neuromuscular control is basically to allow the player to fire their appropriate muscles to hold a good and strong position of the limbs. So this will decrease the forces and the loads going through their limbs and protect their different tissues, their bones, their ligaments, and so on. And there are core components of neuromuscular training, which will be balance, strength and core work, plyometric activities, which are sort of explosive training exercises, and also agility skills, so rapid stopping, starting, twisting, turning, and then this all has to be put into a sport-specific context. As part of the project which we've been doing in UCD, which has been sponsored by the Medical and Scientific Committee as part of the injury database, we've actually gone and systematically looked at the evidence that's out there for neuromuscular training for reduction of injuries. And just to give you, I suppose, a flavour of what we've done, we basically searched all of the different databases and we found all the different studies and tried to pool them together to give an idea, I suppose, of the overall effect. So just of interest here, this is in over 6,000 players from numerous different studies. But overall, because this dot here falls on the side of the middle line here, which favours the training programme, we can say that statistically that there is evidence that multifaceted neuromuscular training does result in a reduction in all injuries. Similarly, we see that there's evidence there for a reduction of ankle injuries and also a reduction in knee injuries. And very recently there was a new study published on ACL injuries, which again is swinging that blob there over to the side favouring the training interventions. So again, good evidence now emerging for these kind of training programs to actually reduce ACL injury when it's rolled out at community club level. Similarly in hamstring, so a specific set of hamstring strengthening exercises will have the same effect. So we're seeing here again that it's favouring the training programme. So this then gave us the impetus to go back to the Medical and Scientific Committee and ask their advice. And what they did then is they convened a subgroup which consisted of Professor Niall Moyna, Dr. Pat Duggan, Dr. Pat O'Neill, Kieran Moran, who's a biomechanist at UCD, and then we had input from John Murphy, who's a physio, who was also on the Medical and Scientific Committee at the time, and myself, to basically look at the existing programs and to develop, and I suppose to modify slightly, to develop a GAA-specific training program. We then went on last year and tested this in 4 teams at UCD, and I suppose of note these weren't novice players, they were already trained and they were already engaged with their clubs, so we got them in the college environment where we could actually sort of at least attend the training sessions and modify what they were doing. The first group had 41 players, so they did this new 15-minute warm-up and their normal training, and then the other 37 players did their normal warm-up and normal training. So we didn't add to the training sessions, we just modified the first 15 minutes of it. And the key question was which group would demonstrate better improvements. If this works, I'll be able to show you just a little snapshot of That's great, thanks. So I actually went onto the coaching website last night, and almost all of these exercises are actually there already. So, and these are ones that you've done yourselves and you've seen people doing. So it starts off with just running drills, looking at hip mobility exercises, then onto dynamic warm-up. We move from there onto specific gluteal activation, so the buttock muscles basically, to try and increase the strength and the activation of the posterior muscles of the hip. So rather than focusing solely on the quads, to focus on the glutes. Looking at, again, precision in single leg lunges, then double leg squat. And then we're moving on to some core work. So again, rapid transitions from side plank to front plank. So again, nothing really static and held. So again, we're very conscious of the time. Again, looking at single leg stance and balance there. Again, working on hip activation and extension, and this is the Nordic hamstring curl. We went on then to look at some jumping, bounding, and rapid running, cutting activities as well. So, and then from here on to single leg jumping. Okay, and I suppose all of this was trying to get stability around the hip and knee. And I suppose part of it really was educating the players as well, and the fact that they could do this and they could actually sort of feedback to each other on what the other player was doing wrong. And we managed, I suppose, to do this in a squad situation, a squad training. So the results, so did it work? So I'm just going to give you the results of 2 tests. The first is a Y balance test, which is basically a dynamic test of balance where the player stands and they reach forwards, backwards and to the side. Here we have both groups. We anchored them so that they started at the same level, so this is just a statistical technique. And this here is the control group, so the people who did the regular training, they started here and they ended up here. So really there was no change in them. Whereas with the group that actually did the training program, they actually increased the amount of distance. And so in other words, this is reflective of improved balance in the training group. So again, I suppose small intervention can actually have a benefit and an effect. And then just the last one I'll show you is the landing error score. So it's a drop jump, so that the player drops off the box, lands, and immediately jumps back up again. It's scored on different levels of the body, and really what you don't want to see is the knee collapsing in. So you need to have good control at the hip and good form really when the landing occurs, because this would be a bad injury or risk pattern. And here we see again that the usual training group, they improved a bit over training, which you'd expect that they would, but the group that we actually modified their warm-up, they actually had a much bigger reduction in the landing error score. So again, evidence that this actually does work and can make a difference. So I suppose in conclusion, the program, which was integrated into regular training, didn't actually take up any more time. It was effective in reducing neuromuscular risk factors for injury. And I suppose this is novel research in male sport, because a lot of the evidence that is out there is actually based on ladies' games, because they are at a higher risk of ACL injury. So I think the GAA have been quite proactive in this regard. So I suppose the take-home messages are that playing Gaelic football, hurling and camogie has an associated injury risk. The GAA have been proactive, and this has been going on, I suppose, in the background for the last number of years, and the LGFA have been very proactive in this as well, and you'll hear more about that in a couple of minutes. The common injuries would be hamstring, knee, ankle and groin. Some injuries are preventable, some are not, and it's really those preventable non-contact injuries that we can hope to modify. The research shows that injury incidence can be reduced by neuromuscular training, and we now have evidence that GAA-specific training program actually reduces the injury risk factors. I know some of you might have been handed out a questionnaire, because ultimately it's you, the coaches, and your perceptions as to whether this is feasible or possible that is one of the sort of key issues here. Because if we're saying that there's evidence to change the way that you warm up and change your training, we have to find out if that is actually acceptable to you. So thanks to any of you who might have filled in that questionnaire, because this will kind of help inform, I suppose, implementation in the future. Okay, thanks very much. That's it from me.